I'd like to begin today's segment with a brief reading, if that's okay with everybody.
Whether it is or not, you're going to do it.
I'm the boss. Okay. This is from Castaneda, talking about Don Juan. He said, he explained that the articulation point of everything seers do is something he had talked about since the day we met, stopping the internal dialogue. He stressed over and over that the internal dialogue is what keeps the assemblage point fixed to its original position. Once silence is attained, everything is possible, he said. So, in this segment, maybe we can just talk a little bit about like how that works and what that means, and then we'll break up the training of that into three segments to follow.
Sure.
If that works, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's like, I don't know.
What is that?
I think everybody knows what that means, but it's weird because it's like in stating that, then you kind of set up a challenge within yourself, and
Sure.
But it's also good to know because it's like, I think for me, what it does is knowing that is in some ways the crux of everything, that there's a certain simplicity that I can bring to bear on all of the practices, especially the ones that seem a little bit more involved or a little bit more fancy or different or whatever they are. It's like that if it always comes back to that first, then it makes it a little bit less.
Well, you can always come back to, again, anytime something's complicated, we back up everything to the simplest point that you understand, right? And so
Right.
we're constantly doing that, right? Because you step into the unknown, and then how do you gauge it? Well, you can only gauge it by the reference point that you have, which is only yourself. So the more that we understand ourselves, the more that we can understand the unknown from our point of reference, right? Or our point of observation and how we perceive it, right? So it's going to be slightly different for everyone, slightly. So I think one of the things that compounds the difficulty of stopping the internal dialogue is that I've heard plenty of other people, talking about, no thoughts or quieting your mind to the point of no thoughts or whatever, and telling people that that's an easy thing to do. And it's not. It's like there's a reason that going to a place of no thoughts, or in the Asian camp they call it Chuan meditation, which is just no thoughts, right? And that's like, in some ways, that's the epitome of meditation practice, right? Is to get to that place. And it's very, I don't want to say it's impossible. It's very difficult. A lot of consistent training goes into doing that, and you only get brief glimpses of it for the longest time, and then those cracks, basically are places that, expand over time of doing it until you can hold longer periods of time. But to be able to just turn it off like that, that's a very high level of work, right? Mm-hmm. And what does the internal dialogue mean? Simply, it's basically naming things. We name everything. And so, because we want to understand it, we want to have a point of reference that everybody else. So I'm saying, I'm pointing to the chair and I call it a chair. And so, to be able to, can you think about how difficult this would be to view a chair and not think in your mind that's a chair? It's like to have the
Right.
structure of it and all of that, and not have that reference point of chair.
But isn't it more than that? Isn't it also like an ongoing description of the world based on your experience so far? So like,
Yeah,
if I'm stressing about something, or I'm complaining about something inside, or having a conversation with somebody in the future in my head, it's like, aren't all of those things just fixing a certain description of the world, and
Right.
and one of those powerful aspects of the internal dialogue, right?
Right. And we know that we go on the idea, and for some people, the knowing that, the world is because we describe it in that way, whatever it is. That's the whole crux of any of these other self-help things, right? Is
Right.
that, you keep your mind, you keep your information in your mind targeted around certain territory or whatever. So we are what we think about most of the time. And, so the more that we sort of engage in that internal dialogue, which we all do all day long. It's just that we're saying, pick the dialogue you want to have.
Right.
And so, but when it comes to seeing, as far as that goes, and stopping the internal dialogue, it's really just a pulling back and stopping the naming of all things, to the extent of sort of having a clean palette in front of you. You can't really identify those objects, which, is where the gazing comes in, and a lot of these other things that we've already done. There's an element of stopping that internal dialogue and stopping the naming of the world. Stopping the world is literally just stopping the projection that you have from the names that you've given it, and sort of fixing things in place, and so engaging with them just on that level, right? So it's a pulling that back, and so that's where these next three techniques come in. Is basically, how do we systematically do that? Because of course, one of the ways that he did that in that series was to put him in situations that he couldn't have a description for, and that incongruency got to be so bad that it just sort of blanked him out. Of course, it was pretty traumatic too.
Yeah.
And we know that that's definitely one of those ways. I mean, people have all kinds of descriptions for it, right? They go into something that's, let's say, traumatic in some way for them, and they'll say things like, the world, everything slowed down at that moment. Like I was moving normal speed, but everything looked like it went into slow-mo.
Right.
Right. And so that's that, slowing down of the world, because you're in this very heightened state at that moment, for whatever reason. And so, we look at all those things, and those are just, ways that we can sort of approach thinking about this, or, before we even do anything. It's just, ways that sort of confirm, like, oh yeah, that, I've had that experience,
Well, also too, like if I'm struggling with a certain technique, and I know that, that I'm thinking about stuff or chattering away in my head while I'm trying to, move to the next stage of a meditation or something, I know that, I'm no longer confused about the limiting factor in the experience or the effectiveness of that meditation. It's like I have something immediately I can point to and go, like, that's what's holding me back right now, or
at least one of the aspects that's there, right?
Right.
Distraction, basically. It's like
right.
It splits your energy into multiple pieces, because you have to think about it. Well, even if you're not thinking about it, but just like engaging them by naming that piece of the conversation that's coming in, it gives you some engagement, which means some of your energy is used to interact with that, and so that's less energy that you have focused on the thing that you're trying to do at the time.
Right.
So I mean, everybody has had the experience of that in normal everyday life, where it's like you're trying to do something that takes a little more energy. Even read a book, which normally would be for most people would be a relaxing and enjoyable thing, right?
Right.
And then, somebody's like, two kids are fighting in the background, or it's like,
right.
Your wife is asking you about some interaction that happened, and it's like, you just can't keep your attention on what you're doing, right? It's distracting.
Read the same sentence 10 times or
right.
whatever.
It is like hearing them like go at each other in the background, It's like that's all of that, right? So it is very distracting, and it is, because part of your attention, as much as you're trying to ignore it, part of it's still attached to that. There's a part of your ear that's still hearing that argument going on, or whatever it is, or
right.
It doesn't have to be an argument, right? It just can be them fooling around in the background.
Yep.
Anybody with kids will get that. There's nothing like children to distract you from doing even something that's fun.
Right.
So,
or trying to carry on a dialogue with somebody when you're stressed about some other stuff that's going on at work or whatever it is, right?
Exactly.
It's like all of these things that, it's like you can't really be there. You can't really be fully engaged with what you're doing because your energy's elsewhere.
And again, it's one of those, this is sort of a tangent, but it is one of the reasons that there's such a big push toward mindfulness these days too. It's a way to, how do I deflect those distractions to focus just on what I'm doing? And I think for the most part, at least from the people that I've heard trying to explain how they do that with people, is that it's more like hyper focusing on what you're doing, to deflect the distractions from the outside. And for us, it's more of taking care of those distractions in a very systematic way to dissipate them and make them less and less until you have a trigger that you can turn on that takes them away and sort of bring you into that hyper focus on what it is that you're trying to achieve at the moment.
Right.
And just two different techniques for the same thing, I just, I mean, that's the way I learned it, so that's the way I'm presenting it, because I feel, for myself anyway, and for others that I've taught, that seems to be the most, that's one of the things that I think systematically it dovetails in with the way that we're trained in the West, that it's like, okay, we want a systematic approach to these things, which is very difficult to do, but in this one instance, and it just so happens to be sort of the crux of doing many things, is turning off the internal dialogue, right? So, in this case, there is a systematic approach for doing that, so I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And it blends well with the way that we're trained normally. So,
right.
Just that's a good thing for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we also talked about was how, we didn't really put this in the beginning of the course, even though it's that key foundational component, because it's like it can seem a little bit on the boring side.
It's not sexy.
It's like everybody's heard it a bunch of times if they've had any, experience with this stuff at all. So it's like,
right.
Okay, I've heard that a million times. So
everybody wants to get to the whiz bang, like poof, phenomena.
Right.
But it's like, what do you need to do to get to that place?
Right. So I think the idea here is like, to kind of, put some of these simpler things into play, and then see how that tracks into the other techniques.
Yeah.
And how maybe it brings them up or takes you further, or.
I think that even if you are achieving some success with what you've done so far, it's going to be propelled into a much better zone when you add this into it. It's only going to enhance it, much like what we talked about before with you are what you think about most of the time, how that sort of produces a certain environment within your mind that's going to be conducive to experiencing those things along the way in a much more enhanced way, right? Because it's constantly what you're thinking about, so your subconscious wants to produce that effect for you, so you don't have to try to describe it anymore. You can actually experience it instead.
Right.
And it cuts that learning curve down. Well, same with this. I mean, there is effort that goes into doing it, and it's simple, but it's not easy, because it takes some tenacity to keep going with it. And I do believe that if people keep it simple and do it in the right way, they're going to, they'll experience some nice, let's say, results from that. Just the practice alone will bring you some secondary results, let's say, of feeling the body more relaxed and having more energy through the day. It's amazing how much energy you spend. And we can say this, but people won't really realize it until they experience it, how much energy you expend on that constant dialogue going on in your mind on a through every waking moment.
And how much energy can be gleaned even from brief periods.
Yeah. It's
of silence.
When you start to extrapolate that information, it's like, oh my gosh.
Well, I remember one time you were saying how people who are feeling really fatigued or whatever, it's like it's not necessarily just the fatigue, and it's not necessarily a physical fatigue of moving through the world or moving through your day or not getting enough sleep or this, that, or the other thing, but it's literally like one of the greatest sources of fatigue is that constant mental activity.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Your brain really does use up most of the energy, even your physical energy of the day.
Physiologically, yeah, it's not just
right. So the more you're thinking and the more you're using your brain, the more fatigued you're going to be, or you need to, bring up your endurance. And now we see that, as a counterpoint to that, they're looking at it from the other side, right? Like, we know that with all the great things that are out there, like, nootropics and diets and all these things that help to refine and make you more clear in your thinking process and all of that, one of the things that's right up there with everything else is exercise. Exercise, stimulating your circulation and becoming more physically fit, literally makes your brain function more efficiently and more effectively. And so, when something's more efficient, you're going to be utilizing, a lot less energy to get the same production out of it. So, I mean, we're constantly striving to make our mechanical items, more efficient, more effective, right? And so they utilize less energy and get more of that output out of each machine. So, it started with levers and it's still going on today, right? So, but, with mental work, it's the same thing. So, getting more physically fit is one of the ways that we can easily stimulate, better mental production, let's say, and more efficient, thinking, when we're engaged in any of these activities. So it's not something to be ignored. I wouldn't put off my physical exercise and activity to incorporate more of the mental work. I find that people have a tendency to dip a bit when they start ignoring those things. It's finding the perfect balance for each person. Not everybody's going to have to do the exercise that you or I do every day, or anybody else. Everybody's going to have to find the level that's optimum for them. And we're always looking for the optimum level. Like any of these, like biohackers and all these people, right? They're looking for the optimum for themselves, and I think we need to keep that in focus too, that, that's one of the things that we're doing as well, utilize whatever techniques and whatever practices we can in order to bring ourselves to an optimum level in whatever capacity, right? So, nobody wants to, do all these exercises and be adventurous and enjoy all of these things, but then they're being depleted on the other side and, sleep deprived and, and just getting worn down over time. I mean, that's not the goal, right? And anytime that starts to happen, it's sort of like, that's when I back up a bit and, take a break for the day and just, look at those 4 areas of your life and even look at your practice, your spiritual practice, and say, okay, what am I doing? How am I doing it? Is it effective? Is it efficient? Am I overdoing it? Because it's very possible to overdo this stuff. I mean, you can become, infatuated with it, and it just drags all your time away, which is never the point for me. It was always, it's a major part of my life, but it also encompasses all the other aspects of my life. So, being relationships and success and health, right? So, I don't want to sacrifice, in those territories in order to, achieve that, but everything else is just kind of gets sloughed off. I mean, it's like, it's not one of those things where I'm going to sacrifice my life to become enlightened. That happens anyway. You don't have to go there, right? It's like the idea is to be able to engage that on whatever level you want and still be in this world and be good in all those other aspects. So a balanced life, and whatever that balance is for each person, right? So you take those old style hermits, and they're off in the woods and they don't have personal relationships and things like that. They have relationships to their work and, maybe the environment, nature, and all of that, but, that part's gone. So that's already a quarter of those 4 pillars that's off the track. And
is that so? What did you mean when you said that you don't want to sacrifice those other areas of your life for enlightenment? That'll happen anyway. What did you mean by that?
You die, so
okay,
you're going to go there. I'm not going to say that dying is the equivalent to enlightenment, but it's like, you're going to make it to someplace other, when that happens. So it's like, the idea is, how does any spiritual activity, if we want to use that broad heading, how does that enhance my life here, right now? Not just in my mental realm and my connection with my spirituality and all of that makes me feel better and I think engage life in a better way with people and all of that. But you know, is the rest of my life balanced as well? You know, or am I feeling, you know, that somehow that's either being ignored or, you know, not engaged on the level that I want it to be? And then, you know, don't wonder why it's falling apart if you're not putting any attention on it. Things fall apart when you don't put attention on them. You know, you don't keep your garden up, it gets overrun by weeds and whatever else, right? It's like whatever the strongest resonance is in that territory, it's going to start proliferating there. So, inattention to one area is going to let the weeds grow in that, and it's going to be a hell of a chore to kind of, you know, take care of it, as opposed to, it's already a lot of work to take care of those things, you know. So don't let it get, you know, to the point where you know you gotta scrap it and start over again. Mm-hmm. That's not the goal here.
Having those things in the place that you want them to be, or let's say a good, you know, what you think is a good place is only going to make things like seeing energy a heck of a lot easier, or any of these other things that you are exploring.
Right,
They
because
support, they don't detract.
Because your anchor in the, you know, in this, you know, zone, in this reality, you know, it gives you sort of a nice tether for exploring that other area, which is a little more dicey, right? And it's like there's not as many, especially if you're moving into those areas that are unknown, which any new thing is, right? You know, it's nice to have that solid anchor. It's like a, you know, a safety net, if you will, you know, harness on with a nice heavy rope attached to it, anchored into this place, and so each one enhances the other. The more secure I feel here is going to let me explore that territory in a much better way than you know, when I get in there and then all of a sudden that thought of, oh, I was very inattentive today, or, you know, all of those things that sort of, you know, compound and distract, it's going to take away from your focus about what you're doing at the time.
Right. Yeah.
So,
so it's I mean, yeah. Right. Because a lot of the time that internal dialogue is regarding the things that we're not pleased with or not good with, or
right,
dissatisfied with, or whatever.
Right, exactly. It's a lot easier to say, you know, if it's something fun that's coming up, you can say, oh yeah, that'll be in a couple days. That'll be great. Can't wait for that. You know, but it's easier to sort of put that aside and say, okay, well, I'll get to that in a couple days. You know, it'll be a nice experience. You know, if something else is, you know, sort of bearing down on you, like, how am I going to solve this problem at work? Or, you know, am I going to make my rent? Or what am I going to do about that? And, you know, those things seem more pressing. And so, you know, sort of tinged with that negative sort of feeling to them. And so those seem to be, you know, much harder to put on a shelf for that period of time while you're doing some other work and mental work. And so, you know, the more that's imbalanced, it gives you more leeway to do that uninterrupted, let's say.
Right.
Your focus will be better. You have more energy to put into it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, we'll get on to the practices.
On to the practices.